as its shelter system is about to overflow. The city is now offering migrants a free one-way ticket to anywhere in the world, as long as it takes them out of New York.
And this is where people can get those tickets.
Now, this comes as the city says it's also considering distributing tents to newly arriving migrants and creating tent encampments in city parks.
We're going to have to find large spaces.
More than 130,000 asylum seekers have arrived to the nation's largest city since last year.
All options are on the table, and it's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
When we reach that point, we need to manage it that is not a citywide visual state of chaos.
Free plane tickets. That might sound insane, but once you find out why the city's doing it, it might make a lot more sense. Will everyone agree with it? Probably not. More than 130,000 people have come to New York seeking asylum, and that's just within the last year. The city's at a breaking point and no longer has the resources to care for new arrivals. Now, plane tickets are quite expensive, especially international ones, but it's probably cheaper than the $12 billion projected cost of this crisis over the next few years. And this comes at a time when the city's own shelters are being shut down for fire code violations.
And breaking news now, another shelter for asylum seekers has been shut down over safety concerns. This one is in Midtown.
The mayor's office tells us about 130 men were moved out earlier today due to an inadequate fire alarm system.
So shelters are being shut down all over town, and that's because the city is using any building it can find as emergency housing, whether or not it's even up to the city's own fire code. And this means that the city has less shelter space than it thought it had. And now that the city's completely out of room, the only thing left to do is offer people free flights. Or something much worse than a free flight, which we'll get to. And you see this handwritten set of instructions? This is what the city is giving to people who've lost their bed in a shelter or who are waiting for shelter placement. A few days ago, the city started removing people from the shelters after they've been there for 30 days. And in another couple of weeks, families who've been there for 60 days with kids, they're gonna be moved out too, which is really sad. But New York's right to shelter rules prevent the city from denying housing to people who get removed from the shelters, which means everyone is eligible to reapply. But first, the city's gonna try to convince them to accept a free plane ticket. But if you won't accept a plane ticket, you might have to accept a tent instead. The former St. Brigid School. And this former academy is actually the city's key to handling the asylum crisis in a way that some people feel is very controversial.
According to the Wall Street Journal, New York City officials have discussed the idea of giving newly arrived migrants tents, literally giving them some form of protection rather than sleeping on the streets of New York.
So it seems like tents could be given to newly arrived asylum seekers and those who've lost their place in a shelter at this facility. Now, this might look like a big building, but it is not a shelter. The city is calling it a re-ticketing facility. And that's because the shelter system in New York is now effectively a revolving door type operation. It is so full that in order for somebody to come here and get themselves a bed, they've got to wait for another bed to clear up, and that can only happen because people are evicted after 30/60-day stays. And this re-ticketing center is now conveniently the location where people reapply for placement in one of the shelters. And by having people reapply for housing at the exact same location where the free plane tickets are being given out, the city's hope is that people accept the tickets and don't actually need to get replaced in the shelter. The tickets are voluntary, and if somebody does want to stay in the shelter, they can still do that.
This initiative comes as Mayor Eric Adams describes the migrant influx as a crisis. More than 130,000 asylum seekers have arrived to the nation's largest city since last year.
Now, the city's critics are going to say that the reason this is happening and people are being given free plane tickets is because nobody here knows what they're doing. The mayor and the governor have just messed everything up. That's what critics are going to say. But on the other hand, New York City law says that the city has to give a bed to anybody who wants it on a temporary basis. The mayor and the governor aren't responsible for making the law, but they are responsible for obeying it. And supporters of how the city's handling this crisis think that it's actually a very shrewd move to offer tickets and reapplications in the exact same facility. The city's own data show that 50% of asylum seekers who leave the shelter do not come back asking to be replaced in the shelter system. And the city thinks its re-ticketing program will be most successful if everybody who reapplies gets offered a ticket at the same time. Also, the journey to New York for a lot of the folks that are here is a long, tough journey, and they come from very sad situations, total economic poverty. people are here and they don't have the means to leave. So I think a free ticket is a great idea, especially if somebody's here now and they realize that they might be better off somewhere else. And it's not a good idea for the city to spend money housing people who wish that they weren't here in New York in the first place. And it's frightening to think about what's going to happen to people who are given a tent and told to wait on the street while a bed opens up. And as soon as this policy was announced, people started wondering, are we going to see tents all over the place in New York City? Some people think we might.
The city is considering handing out tents to newly arriving migrants so they can create encampments in parks and other outdoor spaces.
And that's why we're here over in this massive park by the East River. There's a lot of open space here, and it could be that if the city decides to create encampments of some kind, they could wind up in a place like this. This here is the FDR Drive, and the park area is east of it. That's the river out there. There's a lot of construction over here right now, but there are a lot of things that make this park particularly well suited to some sort of base camp. There's actually like a running track over here. Under the trees, I've seen people doing barbecue and stuff over here on the 4th of July. Water fountains aren't disabled. Running water, that's huge. And there's actually a bathroom facility over here already. And because of the highway, access over here is fairly limited. This could be made into a secure area and sequestered off. And this park is several miles long. It winds its way down Manhattan's east side all the way to the southern tip. There's even this running track. Over here, there's another big open area. Looks like a baseball diamond on the other side of that fence. Here we have the East River. That's Williamsburg, Brooklyn over there. Then Long Island City up this direction. Definitely a nice park, but this is a city-owned park. Now, critics are pretty adamant that taking a public park like this and using it for a specific purpose that denies the entire population the ability to use it as it was originally built is a bad idea. But since there's no more room in the shelters, the city has zero options. And if the city doesn't take areas like this and make them safe spaces for people to have a tent, they don't set up some sort of safe encampment, those people are going to be on their own on the streets. And I think that would be even worse. And in order to abide by the city's right to shelter mandate, which comes from a court decision back in the 80s, they have to use the resources that are available to them in order to abide by the law.
What we're dealing with right now is a depletion of resources that is going to threaten our ability to provide the basic services to New Yorkers. And I can't allow that to happen.
Mayor's got a good point. The city does not have unlimited resources, and if this keeps going, taking care of New Yorkers' basic needs is going to become a challenge as well. The mayor really is between a rock and a hard place on this issue. But if the mayor's statement is accurate that the city has no more room indoors, it's a foregone conclusion that places like this baseball diamond might not be used for playing baseball in the near future. This could look very different in just a few weeks.
Adams says they are currently discussing with leaders in other countries about how to manage these tent encampments, looking at how they could still provide restrooms and showers.
You know, I think that's going to be a pretty big challenge in some of the city's parks, like Central Park or Prospect Park, which are just so open and have areas where there might not be any plumbing or anything. You'd probably have to do something like this and install plumbing and build infrastructure that's not there already. And it could be insanely costly and expensive to develop sites like that. Plus, you might even permanently change the landscape of some of New York's most historic parks. For the record, this looks like it's a raised pier. I'm pretty sure that's what's being built here. You can kind of see the pylons and you can see the infrastructure kind of heading out into the river. So we can't continue all the way down the park, but we can guess at what the finished product might look like. In 2020, the city erected this field hospital in Central Park. Look at that. They had water, they had tents, they had lots of equipment. This was a real operation. 68 beds, temperature controlled, water, heat, everything. If you could build that in Central Park 3 years ago, it can totally happen again in pretty much any park, which means there could be like a showering apparatus, like a shared bathroom that could kind of go along with a campsite. You would need something like that, or people are just going to really be having an even tougher time. And the hope is that between limited shelter stays and the city's reticketing program, nobody is going to have to stay in a place like this for more than a night or two. The New York Post is confirming that these new sites are going to be more like campsites rather than a fully enclosed housing center like what you see here. I think that's Randall's Island. The mayor's also been pretty adamant that he doesn't want tent cities popping up all over the city, and that areas like this that can be used just for that purpose are one of his main priorities. And what that means means is even if New York City does end up doing this, it's not going to spill over onto the sidewalks and into the center of the city. But critics of this plan say that putting people in tents during a New York City winter is a dangerous idea. And you know something? They're right.
We don't know what to do. This Venezuelan mother of three confesses with the inevitable arrival of snow and bitter cold.
That's actually a news clip from Chicago. And in Chicago, it gets a lot colder than it does in New York. That's why they're already getting snow. But that type of weather is going to be here soon. And unfortunately, they've already handed out tents in Chicago, and it gets so cold, they've got to use warming buses to help people stay warm. These are essentially a bus with the heat on inside, which is parked between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. out on the street near where some of these people are camping. That's a very tough situation, and I think that the policymakers here in New York have to be watching what's going on over there, because our weather gets just as bad, and I don't see how the problems that are happening in Chicago aren't going to also be happening here if we do the same thing. Also, with all that snow and those freezing temperatures, I can't imagine walking outside of a tent to try to make it to a communal bathroom of sorts and then having to walk all the way back just to take a shower or use the restrooms. When it's cold in New York, everyone just stays inside and doesn't even want to leave their apartment. But if you're here and you don't have an apartment, things are going to be really tough and downright dangerous. I didn't know this, but apparently you can get frostbite when it's not freezing out. Frostbite, sickness, those are real potential issues. And when faced with potential weather like this, some people are going to decide it's not worth it and that it's time to leave New York City.
Aquí solo hay 4 niños pequeños.
Here there are 4 small children, this Venezuelan father shows us, and a young girl over here pointing to tents where he says families sleep.
Man, this is bad. I really wish something could be done to help those folks. I certainly hope that this same thing doesn't end up being here in New York. But what's interesting about Chicago is that unlike New York City, Chicago hasn't gone about setting up these massive relief centers like the Randall's Island one. And that's why they've got people sleeping on street corners and in front of police stations. Now in New York, our streets don't look like that because we have the massive relief centers. And the folks in Chicago probably think that relief centers would help their streets resemble ours, but now that our relief centers are full, our streets might start to look like Chicago unless the mayor's plan goes through. But what do you think is going on with the asylum crisis? Do you think tents and free airplane tickets are the right solution to this? What do you think the city should do? Let me know. I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.